All right. Well, this is really fun for me. As you might guess from my accent, I'm not from Australia. I'm from America. My name is Edith Harbaugh, and so funny story from last night. I was hanging out with some other people from the conference, and they said, you have an accent, and I said, I don't have an accent. Everybody else has an accent. But they didn't laugh at that. And then I said, I'm giving a talk tomorrow on feature flagging, and everybody started talking about feature flagging, which I love because I'm extremely passionate about feature flagging. I believe that feature flags can help software organizations move faster with less risk. So I loved everybody talking about feature flags. It was a great discussion. About 10 minutes into it, one of the guys I was talking to said, hey, do you know that there's a company in Silicon Valley that does nothing but feature flagging? And I was kind of like, oh, huh. And then he pulled open his phone and he showed me it. And it was a company called LaunchDarkly. And I started to open my mouth to say something. And then he started talking more about LaunchDarkly, and I couldn't really get in at this point. And then I was like, well, this is actually very funny. Inside I think I'm still kind of a 6-year-old kid. And so he told me for about 10 minutes about how there was this company in Silicon Valley who was doing feature flagging as a service, why this was a good and bad idea, what their business plan was. This was great. I let him go for a long time. Finally, I am a nice person, and so I kind of said, hey, that company LaunchDarkly? I work there. And he was kind of like, oh. And so I work for LaunchDarkly. So we talked for about 5 more minutes, and he was also very passionate about feature flagging. And then he's like, "Hey, the CEO of LaunchDarkly, she's a female." So I said, "Yeah, that's me." And he was like, "Oh." So this was hilarious for me, and actually, luckily, it was hilarious for him too, because he was kind of like, "Oh." So, to introduce myself, I'm Edith Harbaugh. I'm CEO and co-founder of LaunchDarkly. We do feature flags as a service, is what I should have said at the time if I wasn't a bit jet-lagged. The talk today that I'm going to give is not about our product. It's about the general area of feature flagging. So I hope that everybody gets a lot out of it, and you don't have to use our product to use feature flagging. Some other stuff I do is I do a podcast called To Be Continuous. I do it with Paul Bigar, who's the co-founder of Circle CI. It's a pretty fun podcast. We sit around and talk about software development. I've been in software, I think, for my entire life. I remember programming in BASIC, not Visual Basic, just BASIC, when I was a kid, back when you had to remember to skip lines. Because if you made a mistake, you sure needed those extra lines. I then had a summer job, actually, as a programmer in Visual Basic, programming for the American government. I started off as an engineer at Epicentric and Vignette. Epicentric was portal management, and I have a couple patents of that in terms of how to deploy between different systems. After that, I was also at Vignette, which is a big content management provider, since been bought by OpenText. These were both good because I learned many ways at which not to build software. So these were the era of the mammoth, 3-year releases that SAP would do, where you would release every 3 years, and everything was on-prem. We didn't think about on-prem or in the cloud back then because there was just software. There wasn't cloud. So you do a 3-year release. Your customers would install it maybe a year and a half after you released it. So you were lucky to get feedback 5 years after you released it. As you might tell, and I hear some laughs from some people who lived through that era, this was incredibly painful because the cycle for feedback, the cycle for bugs was immense. So my company, Epicentric, was considered pretty innovative because we had a year release cycle, which allowed us to move quicker, which allowed us to innovate, which allowed us to get stuff to market faster. Even in those days, though, so a year was not that common, so we would actually have a party when we did a major release. This seems incredible now, like a party when you have a release. The cool kids are probably deploying every 2 minutes. Somebody's probably deployed right now. After I was an engineer at Epicentric and Vignette, I thought I knew more than my product manager, as all engineers do, and I became a product manager. And I discovered how hard product managers really have it. Product manager, I think, is one of the toughest jobs because you are the layer between so many different people in the company, between ops, between QA, between performance, between marketing, between sales. And you're basically a conductor of not a single train, but 12 different runaway trains going in different directions. Then I thought I was smarter than my marketing person, and I was marketing at Concur. I actually came down to Sydney a couple years ago when I was working for them. So I've seen basically everything in software except for accounting, and I have no urge to go into accounting. So the old way of building software really felt like this. You would have these huge releases which had a lot of functionality bundled into it, a lot of bug fixes bundled into it, all coming out at the same time. Because they were so seldom, there was a lot of other stuff that went into them too. If you had a release every 2 years or even a year, you would have this huge marketing launch with it. This felt incredibly scary. You would always have this panic moment of, what happens when I do this release? And quite honestly, almost inevitably, stuff would break when you did a release. Just because the releases were so big and there was so much going on, there was no way to really QA everything. There was no way to see how everything would work in the real world. And you would have this sinking feeling in your pit of your stomach when you're released. Like, what is going to go wrong? Not, nothing's going to go wrong, but more, what will go wrong? How quickly can we fix it? What's the best way to fix it? And who is going to scream at us this time? Is it going to be because it's not performing well in the field because it's very slow? Is it because we just completely misjudged a feature? Is it because we forgot about a migration path and we're actually breaking people's old functionality? There are so many ways that software can go wrong. I think you could pretty much write a song about every single thing that could go wrong when a release happens, and I've probably seen most of them. And then the really bad thing about when a release goes wrong is that you get in this really panicked state, depending on how bad the failure is. When I was at Vignette, we could, actually was at Epicentric, we consider the worst possible thing that you could do would be to destroy a customer's data. Because this wasn't just, their pictures of their kids, this was actually their production sites that they were using to serve up. So an upgrade that destroyed their data was extremely not good. It was bad. We did a release that did that. We were in a panic state, tried to do a release to fix that one. Anybody who's tried to do stuff in a hurry, there's a psychological thing where your brain starts firing different chemicals. It's an evolutionary thing where you're in a fight or flight type scenario. These chemicals flood your brain and sometimes lead you to make very bad decisions because you're not really thinking rationally. So in this case, we did a fix pack A, a fix pack B, a fix pack C in all quick succession. And we got up to fix pack H before we'd really kind of steadied the boat. This wasn't fun for anybody. It wasn't fun for customers. It wasn't fun for us in engineering. It was just a really bad place to be. I also remember another case at Vignette where we'd put out a bad release, and it was in a room where our engineering director started screaming at our operations director. Our engineering director was screaming at, that we'd broken something. Our operations director, why does it take so long to do a release? Why does it take us, a day to get this out into the field? And in my head, I'm like, our engineering director is kind of an asshole. This is our fault. Why is he screaming at the operations director? Now I still think that guy was kind of a jerk, but he was right. Why does it take so long to get stuff fixed? Software is going to break. The sooner you realize that software is going to break, the more safeguards you can put in place to make it better. So now that I've told you about the bad old days, and I hope those are days that if you live through it, you understand the pain, and if you're too young to have lived through it, be glad. Feature flags. So feature flags are basically taking this tsunami of a release and breaking releases down into tiny, tiny chunks where they could be easily switched off or switched on, independent of a full release. So before I go on, how many people are already using feature flags? How many people are thinking about using feature flags? Great. Good mixed crowd. So I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions because we're small. And I love talking about feature flags. So feature flag is basically a way to wrap functionality. It's basically an if then at simplest. And then you have the ability to push out your code and then, separate from a release, turn it on and off for people. So there's a lot of benefits to feature flags. The number one is that you can push functionality to who you want, when you want. The old days of the big tidal wave of everybody gets the same software at the same time, whether they like it or not sometimes, is gone. Being able to operate independently of operations is actually also a huge win. If you want to push stuff out to different people, you don't have to cut a new build. You don't have to walk through pushing stuff to different servers. Your code is all already available. The way I really sum it up is that you can start to separate code deployment from business logic. So I'm going to walk through different use cases of how feature flags can help people. And the number one reason to use feature flags, I think, from an engineering standpoint, is no long-lived branches. I see some heads nodding. So long-lived, I said once, long-lived branches are like a slow-acting poison, and somebody corrected me, and they said, no, they're immediate poison. Like, as soon as you have a branch and you have developers working on different areas, it seems peaceful because these two parties can happily work on their two branches and not have to talk to each other. It's great. You have two people or two teams that are working away and they don't have to talk to each other. So notice what I said, they're not talking until it comes time to merge back. And then all of a sudden, all the things that they didn't talk about suddenly become a big deal. I thought that this was going to be used this way, and you thought this was going to be used this way, but I spent 3 weeks building it this way, and you spent 3 weeks, and I don't want to give up my way of thinking right now. So basically, the longer you have branches going on, the more probability is that people are going to get pissed off at each other when you try to merge them back in. So with feature flags, it might seem like it's a little bit more effort because basically you're putting a shim in and then having two different teams having to be kind of in constant interaction. But really what this does is make sure that your code base is very cohesive and you're not postponing the pain until people have a lot emotionally and physically invested in, well, I already wrote this code this way, and I don't want to undo that. Like the more you spend on something, the more valuable it comes to you. So just from a purely developer standpoint, I think feature flags are very powerful for helping teams work closely together. So this is kind of an inflammatory statement. In development, sometimes I call it, there's this idea of waterfall deployment, where each team kind of throws stuff to another team and says, well, it was my job to get it to this other point in time, and now it's your job. What this happens sometimes in engineering organizations is that you coalesce around different responsibilities for different boxes, i.e. the developers happily code away on their box, and then they say, okay, QA, you go test it over there. Staging is staging, and production is production. In reality, what happens is that QA is usually kind of and staging is supposed to be as much like production as possible, but inevitably it drifts. You can't have the same stuff exactly on staging as production. Also, what happens is that it's really, really hard to get real use cases on staging. Business users are very hesitant to use staging because they know that anything they do there can get blown away at any time. So like what will happen at best is that you'll have a business user who will take a kind of cursory look at a staging server, say it looks okay. You'll push to production, and then all hell breaks loose because they're like, well, okay, now I'm actually going to do the things I want to do, and they don't work. And then you say, well, why didn't you do it on staging? They're like, well, I knew that this could break at any time, so I don't want to invest a lot of time, like, working through all my actual use cases here. With feature flags, what you could do is you can give people access to code live on production, which sounds incredibly frightening until you start to think about what that really means. You still have the ability to turn stuff off at any moment. And I'm not saying to shove stuff willy-nilly into production without testing it. What I am saying is that you can give people access where they want it in a way that works for them. So if you take away one thing about feature flags, I hope it is that it unlocks a lot of power to get feedback from real customers faster. And it also saves then development a lot of time because you're not chasing down random bugs on staging and QA, which can be a real hassle because you could spend, a couple minutes, hours, days chasing down a bug and then finally just say, hey, this is just a bug on QA or staging that we can't reproduce in the whole world. That's very frustrating for everybody involved. All right, so this is a classic diagram from Crossing the Chasm. So basically the idea is that any technology can be seen as moving out through the range of people. Every technology kind of has its early adopters, the cool kids, the cool hunters, and then you have the laggards at the other end. The laggards are the people who who say, IE6 is good enough for me, I don't want to upgrade. Every technology has its curve, and depending on what the technology is, different people can be at different places. And sometimes there's very good reasons why people are at different places. Maybe they've gotten burned by stuff that's too early. Maybe they're a bank and they really don't have any tolerance for new risky stuff because they want to maintain balances. Maybe that's just they feel like being a laggard. The old way of doing software releases forced organizations to kind of cut this curve. You would have people who were dying for new functionality, who said, I want it as soon as possible. And then you have the laggards who are just basically like, leave me alone, I don't like new stuff. And you were forced to push it out to everybody at the same time. What feature flags, what you could do is you can iterate very quickly by exposing functionality only to your innovators. So Circle CI is a LaunchDarkly customer. So they are, I'd say, an innovator. They use us because they have new features that they want to be able to push very quickly to people that they know are receptive to them. And then they can also block people who they know are less receptive. So in reality, when something finally gets released, it's actually very rock solid for everybody under the curve. Because they might have done 4 to 6 to 10 iterations very quickly with innovators. Been like, hey, is this what you're looking for? Is this what you're looking for? Is this what you're looking for? Gotten early feedback, and then started rolling it out. The other really nice thing about this is that you could quickly find out if people even care about it at all. If you push out a feature and there's just the response is not what you want, with feature flags, you could say, okay, our hypothesis was wrong, let's shut this down. The old way was extremely expensive because you basically were locked into release cycle. So early access betas are a really powerful way to use feature flags. How many people do betas already? Great. I think that they're a really valuable tool, both from an engineering standpoint that you get feedback on real-world bugs, but but also because customers like feeling that they're special. This really surprised me when I was earlier, is that I'd be like, hey, this code is really buggy, or, it's not really ready. And people really like that sometimes. They like feeling invested. They like feeling that they're part of basically your product org, and they like giving feedback. So it's a really powerful way to make your own customers feel more involved, as well as to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. A big lesson learned for me was I was at Vignette, and I could not get anybody to participate in our beta. This was a real red flag. If you can't get anybody to participate in your beta, it means that you're not building stuff that people care about. This seems blindingly obvious, but we'd invested a lot of time building some stuff, and then I started going out and asking customers, hey, you want to try it? They're like, no. And I'm like, this is amongst the time so build into your thinking of once you build it, who will get it first. And if it's not something that anybody will take early or take at all, then it's like, hey, maybe we shouldn't build this at all. Opt-in. So early access betas are usually where you ask people to participate explicitly. You can also allow people to opt in. This is kind of a Google Labs type functionality where you might have something on your site like, do you want to get this new feature? Do you want to participate early? Again, this is just a flavor of the other one. It's a way to get really early awareness and get people to be using your system early so that you're getting feedback. Again, the real goal of this is to make life as a developer easier by helping you find the real use cases and find the real bugs and the real scalability pitfalls earlier and earlier in your process rather than late when it's already too late to fix them. Blocking. This is pretty cool. You always have people that you don't want to have see a feature, which sounds paradoxical, but you might have people even within your own organization that are destructive. I've heard it being called the Marissa Mayer rule at Yahoo. I've also been called the CEO rule, which I don't really like, but it's true. If you have some people look at something too early, they might focus on the wrong thing. They might give you bad feedback. So before I talked about feature flags as just in a generic way of a user, you can also block any arbitrary thing. You could block a country. I know Pokemon was doing this when they were rolling out to different areas. You could block a country. You could block an organization. If you know that an organization just physically is not ready to take something yet, you could block them for getting it. Square, for example, I know does this pretty heavily because they have so many people who are in high frequency positions who are scanning cards that they don't want to push features out. So blocking is very powerful to just get back control of your release. Rollouts. So rollouts, I think, are very valuable if you have concerns about scalability. I don't think there's any substitute for the real world in a scalability test. You can load test things. You could try to replicate the real world. But the only real way to see if something will stand up to the real world is to push it into the real world. So with a feature flag, what you could do is you can have a feature that's off and then slowly ramp the percentage of traffic that goes to it. This is a really good technique if you have a backend system, for example, that's maybe sending millions of data requests an hour. You can try to replicate that, but you can't. I love this story. My friend told of he used this really effectively at his company, and the old way of doing a switchover between two risky backend systems is to do it at 5 a.m. or 3 a.m. So you have this risky switchover. You say, okay, let's do it at 3 a.m. and do this hard cutover. This has so many issues that I'll just dissect why this is such an issue. 3 a.m. is not a time when people are at their most awake or aware. I say this because I'm a little jet lagged right now. So you're asking people to do something very risky at 3 a.m. when they're probably half asleep. If something does go wrong, A, they might not be in shape to do it, and B, it may turn out that the people they need help from are not around at 3 a.m. So then you're kind of making these panic calls or like trying to jury rig something at 3 a.m. And C, something that should be very obvious to people here is that 3 a.m. is not 3 a.m. everywhere. We live in a global world now. You can't rely on 3 a.m., being a time when everybody who's using your system is asleep. 3 a.m. here in Australia is 10 a.m. in the States. 3 a.m. in the States is, the day here. So it's not a guarantee. You're going to piss off somebody. So if you use feature flags, what you could do instead is you could instead say, hey, let's do this cutover at 9 a.m. when everybody's in the office. And let's do it in a really controlled fashion where we'll start putting 1%, 2%, 3% of traffic through this risky system. The benefit of that is that everybody's awake. And if something goes wrong, what you could do is you could just turn it off. So the story I love is that a friend was doing this really risky system, and later he was looking at the logs, and he saw that every day around noon, so it would turn up traffic, and every day at noon it would go back to 0. And he asked the engineer, why does the rollout go to 0 at noon? And then the engineer said, well, that's when I go to lunch. I want to go to lunch, and I don't want to have to worry about it. So he would, crank it up to 20%, turn it back to 0, and then come back. It makes a lot of sense. You want people around and able to monitor risky systems. You don't want to do it at 3 a.m. or when people are eating lunch. So I think rollouts are very powerful for back-end systems where you're worried about load. Then a natural slide then is, well, hey, I'm doing this rollout, so I'm basically splitting traffic, right? Why don't I use this then for A/B testing? I think depending on the right feature, A/B testing or hypothesis-driven development is an incredibly powerful tool. So basically, the idea is like, hey, I'm already splitting the traffic. I already am getting metrics back for 2 different paths. Why don't I then A/B test and see which one is better? I love this because I'm an analytical person, but I think A/B testing should be done very carefully. The main issue with A/B testing is that most people don't get enough traffic to A/B test effectively. So when I was at TripIt, we had 10 million users. And even with that much, there were just some things that we could not A/B test. So sometimes people see this as a solution to, hey, we're arguing about something, let's just A/B test that. Unless it's something that you're getting a pretty steady stream of traffic through, like, for example, a sign-up flow, and then you still have to be a fairly big consumer site, you're not going to get enough traffic to effectively A/B. The second issue with A/B testing is that you have to be very careful about whether you actually have metrics that you can test. For example, if you're accounting software, what you really care about is that people renew month to month. So it's really hard then to A/B test a different flow if you're saying, hey, is this making it easier for people to reconcile their transactions? So I love A/B testing. It's just be careful about why you're doing it and the metrics that you're measuring. And it's not just a blind thing of, hey, let's A/B test everything. So Jocelyn, who was the director of engineering at Facebook, said they were vigilant about A/B testing there because they could really optimize on one metric, which was daily activity. However, even then, you can't A/B test your way into good design. Like, you have to have some theories behind what you're doing. So if you can't A/B test, but you are splitting traffic, what's another natural conclusion of things you could do? A classic fight that I've had in many organizations is power versus new users and how to treat them differently. Any system has new users who don't know very much, and then power users who knew a lot. And it's very difficult without feature flags to make them both happy. Your power users want a lot of controls, they want a lot of functionality, they want a lot of features because they've discovered things. Your new users are new. They want a lot of hand-holding. They want a lot of tutorials. They might want a lot of tooltips. With feature flags, what you could do is you can wrap features and progressively disclose them to different users. Again, this ends a lot of fights that I've had within organizations about, but people want this feature. Oh, but this is confusing to a new user. You could say, okay, great. Somebody sees this feature after they've logged in more than 3 times. Or somebody gets this tutorial if they haven't logged in 2 months. So again, feature flags, I'd say, are more than just a kill switch. They're a way at which you can start to segment your users in terms of early adopters, laggards, power users, scalability. And then the next step is subscriptions. So how many people here at a subscription SaaS company? Cool. Okay. So really what feature flags are doing is bundling up code into little logical blocks. There's 2 ways that people tend to use feature flags, and they're both right and correct. One, people use them for very transitory purposes when they're doing a release. So they're doing them to basically validate that this feature will work in the field and will scale up, not break anything, not piss anybody off. So you push the feature out. You eventually get to the end of the curve with all your early adopters, your laggards, your 100%. Then you don't need the feature flag anymore, and you pull it. The second way that people use feature flags is they're like, hey, actually, I realize that long term I do need to continue to split up these different user bases. So that's when you get more into the newbie versus power user. Another way you can use the feature flags then is to bundle features into subscription plans. You could say, for example, that these set of features are only in the silver plan and the bronze plan and the gold plan. This is really powerful because then what you could do is you could start to do one-off subscription plans that formerly were embedded deep in the code. Unfortunately, at big enterprise companies, your salespeople start cutting deals that engineers don't always know or like about. And then they come and they say, hey, so-and-so gets this feature, but not that feature. This is where ugly branches start to happen. It's where you start to have ugly branches and where you start to have stuff that's in code that people don't know about. With feature flags, what you could do is you could say, okay, here, we're not going to do this with branching. We're going to do it with flags. And for example, Morgan Stanley will get this set of features, and Anzac Bank will get this set of features. So you can bundle subscription plans as well as custom entitlement plans using feature flags. So going back to the transitory nature of feature flags, all features eventually go to the bit bucket in the sky. Every feature has a purpose when it's written. Every feature serves its purpose. Eventually there comes a time when that feature should be pulled. And traditionally this is incredibly painful. I talked to some developers from London who said they had a massive 1-year project to get their code base from, I think it was 10 million lines of code down to 2 million lines of code. So actually at their Christmas party, their holiday party, they celebrated the guy who deleted the most code. And this is funny because, traditionally it feels like, hey, it's better to build a lot of features. Why shouldn't we reward somebody for building a lot of features? Features have an incredible long-term maintenance cost. It's not just the one-time writing, it's the maintenance of that feature in terms of, say if you're a SaaS site or a mobile app, if a new browser comes out, you have to retest that feature. If a new device comes out, you have to retest that feature. If you're building other features, you have to retest the interaction of these features. And then if something is broken, then you have to go back and patch it so it works. So the cost of a feature is not just the initial cost, it's also all the long-term cost of maintaining it, maintaining its platforms, and maintaining its interactions. So sunsetting features was really a smart thing to do. Traditionally, without feature flags, it's been really hard because you don't really have a good handle on who's using a feature And plus, it's super intertwined within your code. It's not as easy as just, pull out this bit. If things are nicely feature flagged, though, they are nicely wrapped. So you can very easily see who's using this feature, and then is it at a state where I can pull it? And if I can pull it, it's very nicely wrapped. So sunsetting is a really powerful tool to make sure that your code base is not becoming unwieldy and that you're not having a lot of stale code running around. So I walked through a lot of ways to use feature flags and talked about how I think they're great because I do. Now I'm going to talk about ways you can get into trouble and some best practices for feature flags. All right. So something that comes up a lot is what's the right level of flagging? Should I be flagging at a really high level at the UI? Should I be flagging at a really low level of basically every pull request? And the answer is, it really depends on your own organization. So there's no real answer. I think a lot of people fear feature flags who haven't used them yet because they fear that they have to start doing everything and there's a lot of cruft then. To those people who are just considering using feature flags, I say the right level is the right level that you're comfortable with. So maybe you have a risky new feature or something that you want to start getting some feedback from. It's fine to just start doing that one feature. Usually what organizations find is that they start doing feature flags, and then it's really addictive. And it's really addictive because it saves developers pain. How many people like getting repeatedly woken up in the middle of the night because something broke, yelled at by customers that they shouldn't have shipped something, just feeling the pain of stuff not working well out in the field. Nobody really likes that. So usually what I've found is that people will start using feature flags, and they'll say, hey, this other thing that didn't work, and we did a postmortem, what we could have done differently. Oh, we could have feature flagged it. So feature flags will not prevent stuff from breaking. Stuff still breaks. That's a fact of life. What feature flags do is give you an easy kill switch so that when it is broken, you can stop it in the field. So instead of having that ugly, embarrassing issue affect 100% of your customers and then having to scramble and fix it, you can quickly find an issue much quicker with a select base and then turn it off. So the right level of flagging is really whatever your organization is comfortable with, whatever gets people to buy into that they want to do this. I think if you start off at too low level, it's frustrating for people because they don't really see the benefit. So best guidance is the right level for your organization. Something I do have a strong opinion is ambiguously named flags. Don't do it. Give your flags good names. What's going to happen is that ideally a flag is something that different people within an organization interact with. Not just, so let's talk through something like, say you have a new feature like a new checkout flow. You want to make sure that developers understand what this flag does. You understand that the operations understand what it does. You make sure that QA understands what it does. You don't want to have something ambiguous where different people think it means different things because then they will both start touching it or think it does something else. So this goes along with the next one, which is misunderstood flags. A horror story I heard is that two teams both thought a flag controlled something that they considered their own domain, and so they were both flicking it. They were both turning it on for different people. And it took them a long time to figure out what was happening. They both considered this flag their own. They didn't have very good logging, or I think they had no logging. So it was kind of like they had a config file somewhere where the values kept changing. And then one team would change it back, and the other team would change it back. The other team would change, it's just like on and on and on. The root cause really of here was not treating a feature flag like a first-class object in the system, like of having it stored in a config file without it being really understood what it was for. Along those lines, misunderstood flags can literally bring your business down. If you have a bunch of flags that are a config file and not very well documented, what can happen is that somebody can move on, either from that team or from the company entirely. So a horror story I heard is that somebody had set up a lot of feature flags to basically control the flow of traffic between different systems. So you're basically tuning it so that different publishers in an ad network got different quality of traffic. Everything was calibrated just so. Then the guy who wrote all this stuff left the company. Somebody else showed up, said, basically, what's with this? Why do we have all this stuff at like 0.03 or 0.4 or whatever? Like, let's just put everything to 1. It seems simpler. Changed all the feature flags to be on all the time, and within about a day had brought down their revenue by 94%. Because suddenly they weren't filtering their traffic anymore and they were just flooding publishers with bad traffic. It took them a long time to recover from that. So they were using feature flags for something that was very fundamental to the core of the business, but they weren't treating them as something that was very fundamental to the core of the business. They were sitting in a config file somewhere where a developer didn't understand what they were for. LinkedIn uses feature flags pretty heavily. So they also had a case of this where accidentally they turned on all their feature flags, and basically it was a big mess. So that ties into the next one. It's really important that you remove a feature flag if you don't need it anymore. Before I talked about the distinction between temporary and permanent flags, this is a really important one. If it's a temporary flag that you're using just for the purpose of release, after you've validated that the feature is good, and turn it on to 100, or, and let's take another side, not all features are good. Sometimes you might put the feature out to the field and say, you know what, this feature isn't well received, it's not what people really wanted, let's turn it back to 0. You should still pull that feature out. It's healthy to clean out your code and make sure that you don't have stuff littering the base. So if you're not using a flag because it's either 0 or 100%, really as a good practice, you should go in and remove your flag. I think this is why feature flags sometimes get a really bad rap, is because people say, feature flags are a lot of technical debt. Feature flags are technical debt if you let them be technical debt. Like if you're not going in and making sure, hey, this feature served its purpose and cleaning it out, yes, you will end up with a massive croft. If you say, hey, this is something that served its purpose and clean it up, you will not have that tax. Something I touched on before is controlling access to flags. Feature flags, if used effectively, are basically controlling the business logic of your code. This is something not to treat lightly. You don't, for example, want your DevOps people to have the same rights as your QA people, to have the same rights as your product manager, and who can turn on what. So ideally, in a feature flagging system, you'll have different people having different rights of access. And that ties then also into visibility into non-technical users. I saw some great, actually the talk I want to see after this is from the people from Domain. They've built a great homegrown system where they can have business users have the rights to turn different features on. So the real power of feature flags comes, again, when it's not a juncture or config file that only a developer has the rights to touch, but something that a business user has the ability to manage. And this is what really unlocks the power both for developers and for business users, because the old way of saying, hey, I want to run a beta program, so let me give you a list of 20 people that you're going to hard code in, and every time I want to take somebody in and out of that beta group, I have to do a release. That's really tedious for everybody. Even in a best case scenario, a release will take about 10, 20 minutes, if not longer. So you want to make sure that your technical users are not the only ones who could touch your feature flags. You want to, in the best case scenario, have this something that other people have control to do. Along with this, you want to have logging. If nothing else, to tell somebody not to do something again. like a lot of the things that happen with feature flags are usually not done through malice, but done through carelessness. If you don't know who changed a feature flag and why they did it, you could spend a long time trying to figure out why. If, again, I go back to the config file, if it's just, hey, this value changed from 0 to 1, or suddenly this person has access, but I don't know why, the two things you could do are just change it back, which could be incredibly destructive to somebody else, or, start off these long, ugly email chains of who touched that, which nobody wants to be on that email chain. So I think logging is very key to figure out who is doing what and just talk to them. The final thing that's pretty sophisticated is if you have dependent flags, you want to be able to manage them. For example, if you say somebody in the gold plan has rights to use this feature, but somebody in the silver plan doesn't, that's a sophisticated system. So I think that the best practices for feature flags, I think, basically come back to treating them like the valuable tool they are. Where I've seen people get into trouble with feature flags is where they start just doing them without thinking about how they fit into their bigger culture and organization. And I mean culture and organization, not just as developers, but in terms of who else in the organization will want to use them and when they'll want to use them. And who else should have visibility to them. If you use a feature flag, it's just an if-then statement that one person in one team uses and nobody else knows about it, and then they leave, you're going to have incredible technical debt because you have stuff that's poorly documented and managed. If you treat feature flags as something that helps an organization move faster with less risk by allowing developers to turn code off, by allowing business users to get access, then they could be an incredible help to everybody. So I left a lot of time for questions, mainly because I like hearing other people's experiences. So before, though, I finish, I like to say you can always tweet me at Edith_H. I do a podcast, and its Twitter handle is ContinuousCast. And I know they highly urge people to give feedback, so whether you liked my talk, hated my talk, or wished I talked about different things, I would love to hear your feedback because that's what I do. With that, I love questions.
I'm wondering how you approach a scenario. I haven't done feature flags, but I'm interested in trying it. How do you approach the scenario where you're modifying existing functionality in an existing data schema? And I imagine you must have to decide whether you want to change your data schema to be the common denominator for the new and old feature, or whether you have a separate new data schema and try and sync the data or something like that.
Yeah, so that's a pretty complicated question. Actually, one of our engineers gave a talk just on that.
Okay.
So to give a 40-minute talk in a minute, yes, you can use feature flags for that. The way to think about it, though, is what are you really trying to do? Are you trying to switch between two different systems, or what's going on that you're modifying the schema, and that'll influence how you tackle it.
Okay.
But happy to talk more after the talk, but it's longer.
So you mentioned a bit about A/B testing. Just trying to see what the difference is between feature toggles and A/B testing. To me, they kind of seem like they could be the same thing.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question is A/B testing versus feature toggles. What's up? I think A/B testing is great if you can get a definitive answer about whether A or B is best. I think feature flags have a bigger role to play in development. Sometimes when you just want to roll stuff out gradually and get qualitative feedback from different people. Like, for example, if you're in a SaaS organization, usually you don't want to do A/B testing because that's very harmful to your customers, or you might not have a rollout plan that could handle that. You might just want to give it to a certain organization or to some people within an organization and ask them, like, what do you think about this feature? Where A/B testing is more, I have a pool of 100,000 sub-users and I'm going to test different results. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, I love the theory. How do I actually do this? So that gets kind of back to what's the right level of flagging. If you're really just getting started out, the best way to do it is usually with a new feature, something that's a little bit bigger. Like a customer of ours in the States did it. They had this risky new thing that they really wanted to be able to control, and they used a feature flag to guard it. And that made everybody happy because everybody had a lot of concerns about the risk of this new feature, and they felt safer with it being encapsulated. After that, then the fears that people usually have are, do feature flags work at all? Like, what if stuff leaks out? Or don't I just have to test 4 things now? What people usually see after they do their first couple is that, like, you still want to incorporate testing, but you could get stuff out to real users much faster. Because you could do your internal testing and then say, hey, let's give these to a couple people and get their feedback. So my advice is pick something that's risky and that will help people see the power, and then kind of walk through the process. And then usually what happens is then people have a flywheel of, well, this worked great on this project, let's start doing it on more things. Because again, the real goal of any piece of code is to get it into hands of customers, or to find out very quickly that it doesn't deserve to go into the hands of customers because it's flawed. Maybe the original business reason doesn't work. Maybe it's not something that we want to roll out. Figure that out as quickly as possible. That's a great question. Other questions back there?
When you're dealing with stuff like data integrity, and you change a feature and the risk involved is possibly breaking some of the data, is there plans where you can maybe silo the old version of the data before they actually start working with the new feature? Because you don't, if something does go wrong, you want to be able to make sure people who are using your feature aren't actually breaking something that they really care about.
Yeah. So the question is, again, data. So again, our engineer gave a whole talk on this, which is its own rich subject. Basically, if you're doing something like that, which is you're trying to switch between 2 completely separate backend systems, which we ourselves have done, what we recommend is that you initially put the data in both places and verify that it works in both. And this actually is, I think, a better path than the old way, which would be just to do a hard cutover. If you're putting the data in both places and able to verify it, you really are controlling quality. The alternative without a feature flag is just to do a hard cut, and then if it doesn't work, you have problems. You've lost. So if it, depending on how risky the thing that you're doing is, you do want to put it in both places, verify that everything works with a feature flag, and then flip it over completely.
So in addition to feature flags, there's from my beliefs, there's different types of feature flag, can be kill switch just for release or feature or entitlements. And looking back at how to clean that. So I don't see that, yes, I need to remember to go and remove it later on. That probably will leave some traces of that on the code. If you say, yeah, I need to go and clean it, but that's a rollout flag, so it took a while to go through, or we don't want to delete this flag for now. Teams will move on, do another project or whatever, so stuff will be on the backlog. So is there any other way to do?
Yeah, so the question is basically, how do we clean up feature flags once they've served their purpose?
Yeah, without depending on somebody need to go and remember to delete that.
So I'll put in a very brief plug for my own company, Launch Darkly. One of the things we do is help manage that process. So we can help you we could tell you when a feature flag should be pulled because it hasn't been used for a while. What we recommend that people do is at the same time they put in the feature flag, they also put in the pull request to remove it. So to think the entire time about, hey, this is going to need to be pulled. And then when we send you an alert, you could just do that pull request and pull it.
Is that a config that you put in the launch console? You say this feature will expire in some day, right?
Yeah, we do it a couple with different ways. We let you say whether a flag is temporary or permanent. We also alert you if it hasn't been called for a long time. We'll also alert you if it's always called with the same value, which means that you should probably remove it. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, is this a framework? Is this a framework?
It's an API.
As an API?
Yeah. I have 3 more minutes, so I have time for a couple more questions.
Is there anything that's not suitable for feature flags?
Oh gosh, that's not suitable for feature flags.
Like style changes in a website, you can still put behind feature flags. And
Yeah, it's kind of sound like the Bubba Gump of feature flags sometimes, but I think feature flags are good for most development processes. Like we had a customer who was doing a major rebrand, and they had to change everything. They had to change their website look and feel. They had to change their email templates. They had to change their back-end systems. And with the feature flag, they could have everything ready. And instead of it being a nerve-wracking thing where usually you have to make a big change like that and you're nervous, they're like, well, all this stuff has actually been ready for about 2 days. And we've tested everything live at production. We're just like flipping a switch now.
so that single feature flag in that instance could be the UI, database, domain,
Yeah.
all those things. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they could test it independent of release. So instead of having the rush of, hey, we have to deploy everything and make sure everything works, everything was coordinated. 2 more questions, then I'm around, so come talk to me. Back.
Yeah, so I guess it's just what do you reckon about the sort of the spectrum of development options when you're talking about feature flags? Like you hear some people that say, oh, we only work in master now, but everything behind a feature flag. And obviously the other extreme is ridiculous long branches and merge hell. So I guess maybe what's the ideal number of things, and do you think should use feature flags on basically no branches or some sort of mix?
I'll give, again, a caveat that it totally depends on your organization. Like, if you're moving from long-lived branches, it's going to be a transition to move to trunk-based development. So, like, to have everybody come in the next day and say, we're all going to work on trunk, it's probably not going to work. So I'd say whatever organizational style makes people happy. And I mean happy in a productive fashion, that this is working for them, which again is a bit of a hedge, but I think there's definitely a transition period that people go through from branches to more feature flags. Final question, and then like I said, I love talking feature flags. Come tell me your horror stories, technical debt, success stories. I love hearing them.
You said a couple of times that your engineer talked about data migration. What conference and what's the name of the conference?
He talked for AWS. I don't know if it was recorded, but his slides are online.
Okay, what's his name?
Patrick Kading,
Thank you.
and he wrote a blog post. So if you give me your card after, I'll make sure you get it. Well, thank you very much. It was great to be here in Sydney.